The sun had not yet burned through the morning haze when a sanitation worker cut down Walker Avenue and found a body behind a shuttered fish market. At first, it looked like someone sleeping off a long night, a curled shape among broken glass and discarded fast food wrappers. But when he stepped closer, the world sharpened into a single awful fact. A woman lay still, her eyes closed, the air around her carrying the sour tang of summer and something far colder. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. It was July 21st, 1996. The address was 1021 Walker Avenue, Kansas City, Kansas, a block where vacancy outnumbered foot traffic, where the hum of the highway felt closer than help. The woman discovered that morning was 39-year-old Rose Marie Calvin. She was found face up in the dirt behind the building, her clothing disordered, her turquoise underwear visible, a black bra pushed high across her chest. But the most obvious sign of violence was the mark around her neck, a band of pressure that spoke loudly and simply. The coroner would later list the cause of death as asphyxia by ligature strangulation. Rose's death, in its first raw form, was mercilessly simple. A life stopped, a body left in a forgotten lot, and yet it quickly became anything but simple for those closest to her. For family members who knew her as Rosie, the discovery reopened an entire life lived in the margins. Laughter, struggle, resilience. Her niece, Deidre Dodds, remembered a woman whose laugh could fill a room, and whose troubles never erased the fact that she was family. Deidre saw her aunt within about 24 hours of the body being found. A small, searing detail that would haunt the family for years. How fast a person could be there one day and gone the next. The scene was cordoned off. Officers made notes, took photographs, and gathered what little evidence the lot would yield. Jewelry remained where it was found, a watch, small earrings, facts that suggested robbery was not the motive. There were no obvious drag marks, no clear signs the body had been transported a long distance to the spot. Yet the location itself, behind a shuttered business, away from busy streets, raised the question of whether she had been killed where she was found or moved there after. The summer air, already heavy, seemed to press in on the quiet lot, as if the city itself held its breath. Neighbors and passers-by offered fragments. A woman walking the night before, a semi-truck parked nearby, a man who'd been seen talking to Rose. None of those fragments formed a neat picture. In communities like Rose's, where trust in institutions had been frayed by years of neglect and indifference, people were reluctant to speak. Not for fear of lying, but for fear of being pulled into an investigation that often felt indifferent to those it affected most. From the earliest hours, the family's contact with the police was strained by inconsistencies. A detective assigned to the case, Detective Roger Golubski, a familiar figure in the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, relayed details to the family that would later contradict the medical examiner's report. Detective Roger Golubski told them Rose had been stabbed multiple times and sexually assaulted. The autopsy, however, painted a different, narrower picture. No stab wounds consistent with multiple stabbings, and no forensic evidence supporting a finding of sexual assault. Instead, the coroner's notes emphasized ligature marks and asphyxia. That clash between what the family was told and the official medical findings became one of the case's first and most persistent mysteries. Why would a detective give details that did not match the autopsy? Was it a miscommunication, a mistake, a purposeful misdirection, or something else entirely? For Deidre, and for many who watched the case from the outside, the contradictions were not merely clerical errors. They felt like the beginning of a pattern, a family left to stitch together sense from scattered, often contradicting pieces. There were other reasons for the family's alarm. Rose had struggled with addiction and had worked the streets at times, realities that made her vulnerable and often erased her from the public eye. In a city where victims who were poor, black, and living with addiction were too often treated as less deserving of urgency, the case risked fading into the background. The family wondered openly, If Rose had lived in a wealthier neighborhood or had a different social standing, would the investigation have been pursued with more vigor? Even small details fed that suspicion. Reports of Rose still wearing particular items of clothing contradicted accounts that said she had been found in a different state of dress. The family's memory of seeing her late the night before only deepened the sense that answers were being withheld, and beyond bureaucratic missteps, there was another unsettling factor. Detective Roger Golubski's own history of interactions with vulnerable women in the community. He had been seen with Rose on prior occasions, picking her up, driving her around, and his relationship with people on the margins had, for some, an ambiguous quality. Was he a helper? A handler? A part of the problem? Those questions were not abstract. In neighborhoods where law enforcement had a complicated relationship with residents, even routine investigative practices could carry deeper consequences. Would witnesses be willing to come forward if they feared being targeted? Would statements be taken and then sit in a file drawer? Would potential physical evidence be properly preserved and tested? Each of these questions mattered because they affected the only thing that could bring the family a measure of peace: clarity. As the investigation edged forward in fits and starts, the public record remained sparse. Local news outlets printed short notices that named Rose and the basics of her death, but the story rarely moved beyond those bare facts. The family's calls for more answers met with bureaucratic patience and little in the way of action. Files went opaque. Leads were logged and sometimes closed without a clear explanation. The sense of a door being shut slowly, repeatedly, was more painful than a single closed door ever could be. And yet, even in the absence of headlines, the scene of Rose's death had witnesses. And witnesses, in a kind of stoic, civic way, are the quiet source of truth. A sanitation worker who found the body became, without wanting to, the person who unlocked an investigation. Passers-by who noticed a vehicle parked too long. Neighbors who remembered seeing Rose in the hours before. The person who had last sold her a soda or a cigarette. These ordinary moments stitched together what the official record did not. But stitching is slow, and grief accelerates time. Families wait and sometimes wait again. When friends and extended family gathered to talk about Rose, certain images repeated. A woman who loved children, who could be funny in the way she told a story, who had fought quietly with demons and sometimes lost the battle. Those memories, human and stubborn, pushed against the flattening effect of statistics and bulletins. The human tendency to reduce a person to the circumstances of her death was resisted by those who knew Rosie best. She was not merely a case number, she was someone's aunt, sister, cousin, friend. Even now, some of the most painful parts of the story are small things, the things that reveal how ordinary her life had been and how violently it was interrupted. A family photo tucked away in a box, a voicemail that stopped halfway through, a neighbor's recollection of a joke Rose told at a barbecue. Those ordinary artifacts are the anchors for people who refuse to let the case be swallowed by time. It's also worth asking, and for a moment to imagine, the impossible confidence of a detective who tells a grieving family details that don't match a coroner's report. How does that land? Does the family assume the detective is mistaken? Does hope demand they trust the authority meant to serve them? Or does suspicion quietly seed itself, turning grief into a second, different kind of fight? For Deidre and others, that initial dissonance was the spark that would keep them from sleeping easily for years. During the days after Rose's body was found, investigators cataloged what they could. Photographs of the body, notes on the clothing, measurements and sketches of the lot. They photographed the surrounding buildings, the fence line, the nearby trash piles. They asked neighbors if they had heard anything unusual the night before. A few people mentioned seeing Rose with a man near a large truck the evening prior. A few more mentioned a different pair of shoes found nearby. None of those mentions formed an arrestable lead, but together they created a map of the last known day in which Rose still walked and breathed. As the map of facts grew, some clear, some fuzzy, two broader realities came into focus. First, that the city's system for protecting and investigating the deaths of its most vulnerable was frayed. And second, that within that frayed system, people like Rose had relationships that blended care and control. Friends who tried to help, officers who said they were protecting, and a community that was both supportive and suspicious. It is common in long-term investigations for the first 24 hours to matter most. Witness memories are fresh. Forensic traces are least contaminated. Those early hours are when the architecture of a case is set. For Rose, that crucial window included a niece who had seen her within a day of her death, officers who gave the family contradictory information, and a scene that suggested strangulation by ligature. The choices made in those hours, which people were interviewed, which items were bagged as evidence, whether DNA was collected or stored, would echo for decades. Two questions rise naturally from this early stage and weaves itself into the way we think about justice. How much weight do we give to the voice of a grieving family when it collides with official reports? And how do communities hold systems accountable when those systems seem to fail the people who most need protection? These are not rhetorical exercises. They are the practical, moral center of a case like Rose's. If justice isn't responsive to the lived realities of families, what is it responsive to? By the end of that first week, Rose's body had been moved to the county medical examiner. The autopsy would return a technical answer, ligature marks, asphyxia, but technical answers often raise as many questions as they resolve. The contradictory claims from detectives, the limited public attention, the family's memory of the last hours. All these threads were now bound together, and the knot was too tight for easy untying. As the city continued on around the quiet lot on Walker Avenue, the Calvin family began its long work, making calls, seeking records, trying to pry apart timelines. Friends and relatives held vigils, taped notes to telephone poles, asked neighbors to remember what they had seen. The case was quietly becoming more than an isolated tragedy. It was becoming a question about how certain deaths are investigated and how certain voices are heard. And as those questions accumulated, a darker possibility settled into the edges of the investigation. The suspicion not only that the case had been mishandled, but that some of the people involved with the investigation had blurred lines with the very communities they were supposed to serve. Those suspicions would not remain idle curiosity. They would demand answers, and those answers would require a closer look at official reports, at detectives' notes, and at the chain of events that led to both a body in a lot and a family searching in the dark. What did the coroner's report actually say? What evidence had been collected, and how had it been handled? Which witnesses had been interviewed, and which names had been filed away? Those are the questions that the next phase of the story would confront head-on, and the answers, when they came, would both clarify and complicate the truth about what happened to Rose Marie Calvin. As the medical examiner's office prepared to examine the body and the neighborhood watched in thin, wary silence, one thing was already clear. The discovery behind the fish market was only the beginning. The sterile hum of the Wyandotte County Medical Examiner's office offered a sharp contrast to the chaos that had surrounded the scene on Walker Avenue. Inside, beneath the cold fluorescent lights, the autopsy began. The report was precise, clinical, a document that stripped away the noise and emotion, leaving only evidence. The medical examiner recorded ligature marks around the neck, consistent with strangulation. The pressure had been applied from the front and slightly upward, a detail that suggested the killer had been face-to-face with Rose. There were no stab wounds, no gunshot injuries, and no defensive cuts on her hands or arms. Her clothing was intact, aside from being displaced, and contrary to what her family had been told, the autopsy found no evidence of sexual assault. Those facts, though crucial, immediately collided with the words Detective Roger Golubsky had shared with the family days earlier. He had told them Rose was stabbed multiple times, that her body was mutilated, and that something had been inserted into her body. Each statement was demonstrably false. For the Calvin family, the realization wasn't just confusing, it was devastating. If the detective in charge could distort something so basic, what else could be hidden? In an interview years later, Rose's niece, Deidre Dodds, would recall sitting across from Detective Roger Golubski and sensing something deeply off. He looked at me and said things that didn't match what we were being told by the coroner, she remembered. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. As the autopsy concluded, the examiner's findings were submitted to police investigators. Yet little seemed to happen afterward. No follow-up interviews were scheduled with family members, no public statements were issued, and the media coverage remained minimal, just a few lines buried deep in local papers. Kansas City, Kansas in the mid-1990s was a community burdened by violence and distrust. The relationship between law enforcement and its black residents was strained, and women like Rose, poor, struggling with addiction, sometimes sex workers, rarely saw justice. In fact, more than a dozen black women were found murdered in similar ways around that same period. Each case carried echoes of Rose's: strangulation, minimal coverage, no arrests. In hindsight, those deaths form a chilling pattern. But at the time, there was no task force, no special investigation. Each case was treated as isolated, as though coincidence could explain why so many women were dying in such similar ways within such a small radius. Among Rose's family and friends, frustration hardened into suspicion. The more they asked, the fewer answers they received. Deidre and others began to question whether someone within law enforcement might be involved, or at least willfully ignoring something larger. Every time we called, Deidre said, it was like they were annoyed that we cared. The official case file reflected that attitude. Reports were thin, witness statements incomplete, and evidence logs missing entries that should have existed. The ligature used to strangle Rose, a crucial piece of evidence, was never publicly identified. Was it a rope, a belt, a cord? The records didn't say. The absence of that detail robbed investigators and later journalists of a vital lead. Detective Roger Golubski's name appears repeatedly throughout those early documents. By then, he had developed a reputation in certain Kansas City circles, a detective who seemed to know everyone on the street. To outsiders, it might have looked like dedication, an officer deeply connected to the community. But to many women in the neighborhoods where Rose lived, his presence carried a different meaning. Some later described feeling coerced, manipulated, even terrified. That duality, helper and predator, would haunt Detective Roger Golubski's legacy years later when allegations surfaced accusing him of exploiting vulnerable women for sex and information. For Rose's family, those later revelations were like watching puzzle pieces fall into place, too late to save anyone. In the days following the autopsy, the Calvin family gathered at Deidre's home. They tried to reconstruct Rose's final hours. The last confirmed sighting was on July 20th, near 10th Street and State Avenue, where she was seen talking to a man by a parked truck. No one knew his name, and no composite sketch was ever released. That man, if he existed, might have been the last person to see Rose alive. It's here that one of the most haunting questions of the case emerges. How does a murder investigation lose its urgency before it even begins? Rose's death was ruled a homicide, a deliberate act. And yet, the follow-through looked more like bureaucracy than pursuit. When Deidre visited the police station for updates, she remembers feeling dismissed. "They treated me like I was bothering them," she said in later interviews. "They didn't want to talk about it." The detective who had once promised answers was now silent. Calls went unanswered. Reports, when requested, were not available. In a city already divided by distrust, silence becomes a second form of violence. Each unanswered question reinforced the message that some lives mattered less than others. For the Calvin family, the sense of abandonment was total. And then came another twist, one that deepened their suspicion further. Detective Roger Golubski told the family Rose's body was found decomposed, even though she had been seen alive less than a day earlier. The autopsy confirmed minimal decomposition. consistent with death occurring only hours before discovery. Again, the detective's account contradicted the science. To Deidre, it felt deliberate. "He wanted us to believe things that weren't true," she said. What could motivate a detective to misrepresent basic facts to a grieving family? Was it a simple miscommunication, or was there something about the case he didn't want them to understand? Could the false details have been meant to distort the timeline or divert suspicion? Meanwhile, the neighborhood quietly adjusted to the idea that another woman was gone. Behind the former fish market, flowers appeared. Someone painted a small cross on the fence post. People talked in hushed tones, lowering their voices when patrol cars rolled by. There was fear, but also a grim familiarity. They had seen this pattern before. Reporters at local radio stations later noted that many of the murdered women shared demographic similarities: middle-aged, black, struggling economically, some with histories of sex work or addiction. Each was killed by strangulation or blunt force trauma. The pattern should have demanded attention. But inside the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, it didn't. When journalists asked years later why no task force was formed, retired officers gave vague explanations about limited resources and case complexity. But the families heard a different message, that the system had quietly decided whose murders were worth solving. Around this time, Deidre began to suspect that Detective Roger Golubski's interest in her aunt went beyond professional. Multiple women later accused him of coercion and exploitation, using his badge to take advantage of those with nowhere to turn. Rose, they believed, might have been one of them. If that's true, then Rose's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a possible intersection of abuse and impunity, the kind of collision that rarely comes to light until years later. And if it wasn't true, then it still demanded scrutiny, because the detective's actions had already tainted the investigation through deceit. As the months passed, the case file thickened only slightly, mostly administrative notes and follow-ups that went nowhere. By the end of 1996, no suspect had been named publicly. Evidence sat in storage, and Rose's name was added to a growing list of unsolved homicides involving women of color in the city. For Deidre, the idea that her aunt might become a statistic was unbearable. She continued visiting the police station, leaving messages, pushing for updates. "They told me it was being looked into," she later said, "but you could tell it wasn't." Years later, when investigative journalists began probing Detective Roger Golubski's career, Rose's case resurfaced. It was one of several deaths that seemed to orbit his professional life. Cases where the detective's name appeared, the victims were women from the same communities he patrolled, and the outcomes were uniformly unresolved. One KCUR reporter would later write that the lack of progress in these investigations suggests either staggering incompetence or deliberate neglect. For families like the Calvins, those words confirmed what they'd felt all along. Looking back, the early weeks of Rose's case represent a fork in the road, a moment when proper procedure could have set justice in motion. Instead, conflicting statements, missing evidence, and institutional indifference turned the investigation into a maze with no exit. Still, certain questions remained unavoidable, pressing through the fog of time and paperwork. If the detective responsible for solving Rose's case had already blurred ethical lines with her while she was alive, could that relationship have shaped the way her death was investigated? And if so, what does that mean for every other woman who trusted him? Those questions would not be answered in 1996, but they would echo louder with each passing year as more stories about Golubski emerged. Stories that suggested Rose's death might have been part of something larger, something systemic. By the time winter settled over Kansas City that year, the alley behind the old fish market was quiet again. The tape had been taken down. The lot had returned to being what it was before, another forgotten corner in a forgotten part of town. But for those who knew Rose, forgetting wasn't an option. The autopsy had closed one chapter of the investigation, but the contradictions it exposed had opened many more. And somewhere, buried in those contradictions, lay the truth of what really happened to Rose Marie Calvin. As her family pushed for answers, they began to retrace her steps, her last days, her habits, her friends, searching for anything the police had overlooked. In the process, they discovered details about her life that painted a fuller picture of who she was and the quiet strength she carried through years of struggle. And now, the focus shifts from the investigation to the woman at the center of it, to who Rosemarie Calvin was, and the final 24 hours that changed everything. Before the headlines and the autopsy reports, there was simply Rosemarie Calvin, a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a woman trying to piece her life together in a city that often offered more obstacles than opportunities. Born and raised in Kansas City, Kansas, Rose grew up in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Friends remembered her as outspoken but kind, someone who could make a whole room laugh even when her own heart was heavy. She loved cooking, collard greens, cornbread, fried chicken, and she often showed up at family gatherings with more food than anyone could eat. By her late 30s, Rose had faced her share of hardships. Life hadn't been easy. Like many in her community, she battled addiction and economic instability. But those closest to her knew she was trying to get back on her feet. She was staying with relatives from time to time, picking up odd jobs, and talking about finding more stable housing. She was trying, Deidre would later say in an interview. People saw her past, but I saw how hard she was fighting to change her future. In the summer of 1996, Rose spent most of her days moving through the familiar grid of Kansas City's East Side, State Avenue, 10th Street, Central Avenue, the kinds of places where faces change but stories stay the same. The neighborhoods were worn but alive, filled with small grocery stores, check-cashing shops, and corner bars where locals gathered after long days. That summer was particularly hot, the air heavy with humidity. On the night before she was found dead, witnesses recalled seeing her near a convenience store around 10th and Washington Boulevard. She was reportedly talking to a man by a dark-colored pickup truck. They seemed to know each other. No signs of conflict, just a casual exchange under the glow of a flickering streetlight. From there, the timeline becomes murky. Some neighbors believed they saw Rose walking toward Walker Avenue, heading in the direction where her body would later be discovered. It was late, and few people were outside. No cameras, no cell phone records, just fragments of memory and rumor. The next morning, when word spread that a woman had been found behind the old fish market, no one immediately connected the name. But as details trickled out, dread settled in. When they said she had ligature marks on her neck, I just knew, Deidre later said. Something inside me broke. In the aftermath, friends and relatives replayed their last conversations with Rose. She'd mentioned being tired, not just physically but emotionally. She felt watched, uneasy, though she never said by whom. She told me once that someone kept pulling up on her, asking questions, recalled one friend. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted to be left alone. Could that person have been someone she knew from the streets, or someone wearing a badge? The question still lingers decades later. To understand the vulnerability Rose lived with, it helps to understand Kansas City, Kansas during that period. The city's eastern corridor was deeply segregated, shaped by years of systemic neglect. Poverty, addiction, and police distrust were deeply intertwined. For many women like Rose, surviving day to day meant navigating that dangerous intersection of dependency and fear, where addiction drew you into risky spaces and poverty trapped you there. That context is essential because it wasn't just Rose's life that made her vulnerable, but the environment that allowed predators to move unnoticed. As later investigations revealed, this same community had become a hunting ground for men who understood that these women were unlikely to be believed if something happened to them. Rose's family knew about her struggles, but never stopped caring for her. Deidre, in particular, had a close bond with her aunt. She was like a second mom to me, she once said. Even when she was going through stuff, she'd still check on us, make sure we were okay. When the news of Rose's death reached the family, the grief was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Not only had she been taken from them, But the people responsible for finding her killer didn't seem to care. They made it feel like she didn't matter because of how she lived, Deidre said. But she mattered to us. She mattered a lot. In the weeks after the murder, Deidre retraced Rose's steps, walking the same streets, asking the same questions. She visited the convenience store, the corner bar, the alley where Rose was found. People were reluctant to talk. Some said they didn't see anything. Others said they'd heard rumors that the police were involved somehow. In 1996, that was a dangerous thing to say out loud. Kansas City, Kansas was a place where speaking against authority could mean losing your safety, or your job, or worse. So the whispers stayed whispers. There's something haunting about the ordinariness of Rose's final night. No fight, no cry for help, no signs of struggle reported by witnesses. Just another evening that quietly turned into tragedy. How many times had she walked those same streets without incident? How many near misses had there been before the night that wasn't? It's a question that still gnaws at those who've studied her case. Was Rose's death random, or had someone been watching her for a while, waiting for the right moment? What we know for certain is that Rose didn't leave behind chaos or confusion. She left behind people who loved her deeply. Her family, especially Deidre, carried her memory forward even as years turned into decades. Each anniversary, they gathered, prayed, and shared stories about her laughter, her stubbornness, and her determination. Rose's story also became a symbol for others. Her death, and the failures surrounding its investigation, represented an entire generation of women whose cases were dismissed or ignored. The pattern wasn't invisible, it was simply inconvenient for those in power to acknowledge. As the years passed, those patterns began to surface publicly. Journalists and activists started connecting names, dates, and police reports. The same detective's name, Detective Roger Golubski, appeared again and again in the files. Some of the women he was accused of exploiting were connected by geography, lifestyle, or circumstance to Rose herself. In hindsight, it's chilling to think that while Rose's family was searching for answers in 1996, other women were being placed in danger by the same man who claimed to be investigating her death. The deeper her family looked into Rose's life, the more they found hints of familiarity. People who said they'd seen Detective Roger Golubski talking to her. Others who believed she was one of several women he regularly checked in on. Whether those interactions were professional or predatory is a question no one in law enforcement has ever publicly answered. But for Deidre, the pattern was clear. It wasn't random, she said years later. I think he knew her, and I think that's why nothing was done. If that's true, then Rose's murder wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a cycle that the system itself helped sustain. As the investigation into her death faded into bureaucratic silence, her story joined the quiet archive of unsolved cases, each one representing a family still waiting, still hurting, still asking for truth. But that waiting wouldn't last forever. Years later, when the name Detective Roger Golubski reemerged in connection with federal indictments and human rights investigations, Deidre saw a chance to bring Rose's case back into the light. She started contacting journalists, gathering documents, and pushing for accountability once again. That renewed attention would pull old wounds wide open, not just for the Calvin family, but for Kansas City as a whole. Because to understand what happened to Rose, the city would have to confront its history of corruption, silence, and the women whose lives were treated as disposable. And that reckoning, long overdue, began with a single question asked by a niece who refused to be silent. If a detective could lie about how her aunt died, what else was he capable of hiding? As the years moved forward, that question would spark investigations far beyond Rose's case, leading into a dark web of misconduct allegations and systemic failures. A web that might finally reveal why justice for Rose Marie Calvin has remained just out of reach for nearly 3 decades. And that's where the story continues. From the quiet grief of one family to the explosive allegations that would expose one of Kansas City's most troubling law enforcement scandals. In the days following Rosemarie Calvin's death, the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department opened a homicide investigation. On paper, it seemed like a routine process, a tragic but solvable case in a city already familiar with violence. But almost immediately, the investigation began to unravel in ways that would later define not only this case, but a much larger scandal that would stain the department for decades. Detective Roger Golubski was assigned to the case. He was a seasoned officer by then, with a reputation that carried weight both inside and outside the precinct. To some, he was the cop who could solve impossible cases. To others, especially women living in the city's poorest neighborhoods, his name invoked fear. From the start, there were signs something wasn't right. The official reports were brief, vague, and missing key information. There were no detailed witness interviews, no record of canvassing nearby homes or businesses. The few pages that did exist focused more on Rose's background, her history of addiction, her time on the streets, than on finding who killed her. To anyone reading those reports now, the implication is impossible to miss. The investigation didn't fail because of a lack of leads, but because of a lack of effort. In most homicide cases, investigators document every minute of the victim's final day. But in Rose's file, there's barely a timeline. The man she was seen with near 10th Street? Never identified. The ligature used to strangle her? Never publicly described or tested. Even the time of death remains vaguely recorded, as though precision didn't matter. When Deidre Calvin requested updates, she was told the investigation was ongoing. But months went by, then years, and no one ever called her back. "It was like they wanted us to forget," she said, "but I couldn't forget. Not when I knew something was wrong." That feeling, that something was deeply wrong, became stronger when other families in Kansas City began sharing eerily similar stories. Women found strangled in alleys, behind abandoned buildings, near parks. Their names blurred together: Mary, Benita, Sheena, Crystal. Most were black. Many struggled with addiction. All were found dead within a few miles of where Rose was discovered. Local journalists began noticing too. But each time they asked the police if the cases were connected, the response was the same: no evidence of a serial offender. Instead, investigators pointed to drugs, prostitution, and high-risk lifestyles, phrases that, in practice, meant the cases received less urgency. Within the department, Detective Roger Golubski's name surfaced repeatedly. He was assigned to many of these cases, sometimes officially, sometimes informally. And when federal investigators later reviewed his career, they discovered a disturbing pattern. Dozens of women had accused him of sexual coercion, extortion, and abuse of power, often targeting those in vulnerable positions. For Rose's family, this revelation, years later, wasn't shocking. It was confirmation. "He was the one who told us lies from the beginning," Deidre said. "Now we know why." It's difficult to overstate the sense of betrayal the community felt as these allegations emerged. Golubski had built his career in neighborhoods where residents already mistrusted police. He patrolled the same streets where so many of these women lived and died. He was supposed to protect them. Instead, he allegedly preyed on them. The most haunting part of the story is that many victims, like Rose, were known to police before they were killed. Some had reported threats. Others had told friends they felt unsafe around certain officers. But in a system where complaints against law enforcement were routinely dismissed, their words carried little weight. When Deidre pressed for updates, she was once again told to be patient. But patience doesn't bring justice, and silence doesn't heal. Over time, she began keeping her own notes, documenting every interaction, every contradiction. "If they wouldn't investigate," she said, "I would." One of her first discoveries came years later, through media reports. Detective Roger Golubski's long career was under federal scrutiny. The U.S. Department of Justice had begun investigating him for civil rights violations and sex trafficking-related crimes, with some of the alleged misconduct dating back to the 1990s, the same period when Rose was killed. That news reignited old pain. Suddenly, the idea that Rose's murder had been neglected out of incompetence seemed less plausible. What if the neglect was intentional? What if her death was linked, directly or indirectly, to the man who had overseen the case? It's a theory that remains speculative, but one that many in Kansas City refuse to dismiss. Because when you look at the broader picture, the repeated failures, the overlapping victims, the silence, coincidence becomes harder and harder to accept. How many women were dismissed simply because they weren't deemed respectable enough to fight for? The more Deidre learned, the clearer it became that Rose's case existed inside a larger web of misconduct. Investigative journalists later found that complaints against Golubski had been whispered about for years. Women accused him of using his position to demand sexual favors in exchange for protection or leniency. Some said he used threats and planted evidence. Others described being assaulted by him outright. Yet, despite those rumors, he remained on the force for decades, even rising through the ranks. That wasn't an oversight. It was a system protecting its own. For Rose's family, that realization was infuriating. The person they once believed was working to solve her murder might have been part of why it was never solved at all. Still, without physical evidence, proving anything after all these years remains difficult. The crime scene was poorly preserved, the evidence mishandled, and key details missing from reports. The possibility of DNA testing today exists, but only if the original samples were stored properly, and no one can say for sure that they were. The injustice extends beyond the Calvin family. Rose's death was one of many that should have demanded reform, yet it took decades and multiple lawsuits for the department to face accountability. Even now, not all the files from the 1990s cases have been released publicly. Among them may be the missing pieces, evidence logs, photos, lab results that could reveal what really happened. But time is cruel to cold cases. Witnesses die, memories fade, and evidence disappears. Still, the human memory can be remarkably stubborn. In 2022, after federal charges against Golubski were announced, Deidre said she felt both vindicated and heartbroken. It took them almost 30 years to listen, she said. If they'd listened sooner, maybe other women would still be alive. The investigation into Rose's death might have started as a single unsolved case, but it now sits at the crossroads of something far larger. A decades-long reckoning with corruption, exploitation, and systemic indifference in Kansas City's justice system. When we look back at the files, the gaps are glaring. But even more striking is what those gaps represent. The stories never told, the evidence never collected, the families never believed. And behind all of it stands one haunting question. What happens when the people responsible for seeking justice are the very ones preventing it? For Deidre, the answer is both simple and painful. You don't stop, she said. You keep fighting. You keep talking about her until someone listens. And that persistence, one woman's refusal to let her aunt's name disappear, would soon collide with the growing national spotlight on police misconduct, forcing long-buried truths to finally surface. That's where the next chapter unfolds, as the cracks in Kansas City's police department widen, and the story of Rosemarie Calvin becomes inseparable from the unraveling of one of the most disturbing patterns of abuse in modern American law enforcement history. By the early 2000s, Rosemarie Calvin's murder had become one of dozens of cold cases sitting on the shelves of the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. Her name, like so many others, faded into the background. Rarely mentioned, barely remembered beyond her family's quiet grief. But behind those forgotten case numbers, something much larger was festering. It started with whispers, stories exchanged between women in the city's toughest neighborhoods. They spoke about a detective who pulled them over without cause, who demanded favors in exchange for protection, who seemed untouchable. His name was Detective Roger Golubski. At first, few believed them. In a city where poverty, addiction, and fear often kept people silent, their words carried little authority. But slowly, as journalists and advocates began piecing together the stories, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Women across Kansas City, primarily black women, described similar encounters with Detective Roger Golubski. He allegedly used his badge as leverage, targeting those least likely to be believed. Some said he coerced them into sex by threatening to arrest them or their loved ones. Others claimed he forced them into relationships, promising protection from prosecution or rival dealers. And many of these same women, or their friends, would later end up missing or dead. When investigative reporters from outlets like the Kansas City Star and The Intercept revisited the city's unsolved murders of women from the late 1980s through the early 2000s, they found a disturbing overlap. A significant number of victims were connected, directly or indirectly, to Golubski or the areas he patrolled. Among them was Rosemarie Calvin. Her death in 1996 had all the hallmarks of the pattern. A woman from the city's margins, strangled, dumped near public view, and forgotten by a department that refused to investigate deeply. For years, these connections were treated as coincidences. But to the families of the victims, coincidence was a poor explanation for so many similar tragedies. It wasn't one bad case, one activist said. It was a system that let predators hide behind a badge. By 2017, a renewed wave of scrutiny hit the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. Civil rights attorneys began revisiting wrongful convictions tied to Detective Roger Golubski's work. One of the most notable cases was Lamont McIntyre, a young man wrongfully convicted of a double murder in 1994, a conviction secured largely through testimony manipulated by Golubski. After more than 2 decades in prison, McIntyre was exonerated in 2017. His release opened a floodgate of questions. If Detective Roger Golubski had framed innocent men, what else was he capable of? And how many women's deaths, like Rose's, were left uninvestigated because the truth would have led back to him? As lawsuits and testimonies accumulated, the Department of Justice began taking notice. By 2019, federal investigators had opened a formal inquiry into Golubski's conduct. The more they uncovered, the darker the story became. In September 2022, a federal grand jury indicted Detective Roger Golubski on multiple counts, including deprivation of civil rights and kidnapping and sexual assault under color of law. The indictment described years of abuse, women forced into sexual acts, threatened with arrest, and left vulnerable to violence. Some of the alleged victims overlapped with unsolved homicide victims from the same neighborhoods. It wasn't proof that Detective Roger Golubski killed anyone, but it was enough to confirm what many families, including Rose's, had suspected all along, that his corruption and abuse of power had cost lives, even if indirectly. For Deidre Calvin, that indictment was a bittersweet moment. It didn't bring her back, she said, but at least the truth started coming out. Federal investigators also revealed that Detective Roger Golubski wasn't acting alone, that other officers, supervisors, and city officials had ignored complaints for years. Women had filed reports, and community leaders had raised alarms, but each time, the system shielded him. The corruption wasn't hidden in plain sight, it was normalized. When journalists revisited Rose's 1996 case file, the omissions became almost symbolic of everything wrong with that system. A missing evidence log, unrecorded witness statements, no follow-up reports. To outsiders, it looked like negligence, but to those who knew Golubski's history, it looked like something worse, deliberate silence. That silence is what defines so many of the city's cold cases. Families remember calling detectives and being told to stop asking questions. Mothers were warned they were making trouble. Sisters were told to move on. In Kansas City's poorest communities, justice was a luxury few could afford. But when the federal indictments dropped, those same families found their voices again. Press conferences were held. Candlelight vigils returned to the streets where the victims were last seen. Photos of women like Rose, grainy, faded, sometimes the only ones left, began circulating online. Suddenly, the forgotten were being remembered. For Deidre, it meant Rose's name was back in the headlines after nearly 3 decades. She started working with journalists and advocacy groups, pushing for DNA testing and record transparency. The same persistence that had once been dismissed as obsession was now recognized as courage. The movement expanded beyond Kansas City. Across the country, families of unsolved homicide victims began drawing parallels between Rose's story and others involving police corruption or negligence. What emerged was a chilling realization that justice often depends not on what happened, but on who it happened to. For too long, Rose and women like her were treated as disposable, their lives measured by their struggles instead of their humanity. But through the work of survivors, advocates, and federal investigators, that narrative began to shift. The city that once looked away was now forced to confront its own reflection. In a public statement, the Department of Justice called Golubski's alleged crimes an egregious abuse of power that targeted the most vulnerable. It was the kind of acknowledgement Rose's family had waited decades to hear, that their loss mattered, that their voices were right all along. Still, the questions remain. Was Rose's murder connected to Detective Roger Golubski's web of abuse? Were there others involved? And how many other cold cases from that era could still be linked if the truth were fully exposed? For now, there are no definitive answers, only a growing demand for accountability. But there is progress. New investigative units are being formed, old case files reopened, and communities empowered to speak without fear. Rose's name, once forgotten, is now part of that fight, not just for her, but for every woman whose story was buried under decades of neglect. The pattern is clear. The reckoning has begun. And though justice may come slowly, it comes because people like Deidre refuse to stop asking the hardest question of all. Who protected the predator? By the time Detective Roger Golubski stood before a federal judge in September 2022, the city he had once patrolled had already changed. The courthouse steps that once hosted quiet vigils were now crowded with news cameras, family members of the dead, and advocates holding signs that read, "Justice for the Forgotten Women." For years, the accusations against Detective Roger Golubski had existed in whispers, in court motions, in the memories of women too afraid to speak publicly. But now, those stories were being read aloud in federal indictments, in black and white, under oath. The charges detailed a pattern of civil rights violations, sexual abuse, and kidnapping. According to prosecutors, Golubski had spent decades targeting women, many of them poor, black, or struggling with addiction, under the protection of his badge. For the families of Kansas City's unsolved murder victims, this was the moment they had waited for. Not because the indictment solved those cases, but because it finally acknowledged what they had known all along, that the same man sworn to protect them had exploited their vulnerability. Among those standing outside the courthouse that day was Deidre Calvin, Rose's sister. She held a worn photo of Rose, a snapshot from before the world turned cold. The same smile, the same warmth. "I told them he lied about her," she said to reporters, "and now they see who he really was." It had taken more than 25 years, but the walls were finally cracking. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings were measured and procedural. A man in his 70s, once feared and untouchable, now facing the federal government. Detective Roger Golubski pleaded not guilty to all charges, but for those who had spent decades shouting into the void, the plea didn't matter. The system that had protected him was finally forced to confront itself. And outside those courtroom doors, something bigger was happening. National outlets began covering the case, CNN, The Intercept, NBC News, and local stations that had once hesitated to touch it. They told the stories of the women connected to Detective Roger Golubski's beat, the mothers, daughters, and sisters whose deaths were filed away as unsolved. Reporters highlighted the eerie consistency: strangulation, dumped bodies, lack of follow-up. The stories that once seemed isolated were now threads in the same dark fabric. Deidre became one of the case's most persistent voices. She gave interviews, joined advocacy panels, and worked with legal teams pushing for a federal cold case review of Rose's murder. Her tone was never vengeful. It was determined. "I just want her name to mean something," she told one reporter. For families like hers, justice had become more than a verdict. It was visibility, validation, and the assurance that the truth was finally being heard. As the federal case unfolded, prosecutors began describing Golubski's alleged behavior as part of a systemic culture of silence within the KCKPD. It wasn't one man acting in isolation, they said. It was an entire structure that allowed exploitation to go unchecked. Documents revealed that complaints had been filed against Golubski decades earlier, but they were quietly dismissed or buried. Officers who tried to speak up faced retaliation. Some were demoted, others transferred. The department's unofficial motto seemed to be, "Protect the badge, no matter who it harms." That realization raised a haunting question for many viewers watching the story unfold. If those early complaints had been taken seriously, how many lives might have been saved? Federal investigators began interviewing past victims, witnesses, and family members tied to old cases. Some hadn't spoken to law enforcement in decades. Others had given up hope long ago. But now, with new faces asking questions, investigators who weren't part of the old KCK network, doors began to open again. Deidre turned over every piece of evidence she had kept. Old letters, police notes, her own meticulous documentation of every call and promise made to her family over the years. The details were painful to relive, but she understood the stakes. "If telling it again helps one person get justice," she said, "then I'll keep telling it." The press coverage helped renew interest in the broader backlog of unsolved homicides. In 2023, several community organizations in Kansas City began compiling lists of women whose cases fit the same profile as Rose's: strangled, dumped, or left in public spaces between the 1980s and early 2000s. Some of those cases were so old that paper files were missing or destroyed. Others contained evidence that had never been processed. The pattern was undeniable, but proving direct links remained difficult. Still, the public reckoning forced action. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation and federal authorities began reviewing decades-old evidence logs, and for the first time, there was talk of DNA testing on certain cases that had long been dormant, Rose's among them. The technology that didn't exist in 1996 could now potentially tell a story the original investigators never cared to hear. But even as hope returned, frustration lingered. The federal indictment against Golubski didn't include any murder charges. It focused instead on sexual assault and civil rights violations. To many, that felt incomplete. "He destroyed lives," one advocate said. "He doesn't have to be the one who pulled the trigger or tied the rope to be responsible." The courtroom scenes were somber. Each appearance reminded families of the years lost, the birthdays missed, the graves visited alone. Yet for every headline about Golubski's defense team, there were new ones about the women whose names were finally being spoken aloud. Rose's story was among them, her name listed alongside dozens of others as journalists mapped the wider impact of police corruption in KCK. The once quiet city was now part of a national conversation about race, power, and accountability in American policing. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative series began re-examining the city's history, each one finding new threads that traced back to the same source. As one reporter put it, "When you start pulling at any corner of the Kansas City Police Department's history in the 1990s, you eventually end up at Golubski's desk." For Deidre, the exposure brought both relief and renewed grief. The wider the story spread, the more she had to relive the night her sister was found. "It's like reopening a wound that never healed," she said. "But at least now the world can see what we've been living with." In those moments, viewers around the world asked the same question that had haunted Deidre for years. When justice comes this late, does it still heal the same? The case became a study in institutional failure, a reminder of how unchecked power corrodes justice. Yet it also became a symbol of persistence, the refusal of one family and an entire community to be silenced. And as the federal proceedings moved forward, the nation watched, not just for a verdict, but for accountability. Because beneath every headline about Golubsky was the same unspoken truth. For every charge listed, there was another name, another life, another story still waiting to be told. For Rosemarie Calvin, that story wasn't over. Her name was now part of a movement. And that movement, slow, painful, relentless, was proof that even in silence, justice can still echo. When the headlines faded and the courthouse lights dimmed, Kansas was left to face what remained, the quiet aftermath of revelation. The federal indictments had shaken public faith, but real justice, the kind that rewrites systems, takes more than a courtroom victory. It takes persistence. In early 2023, a small office inside City Hall became the heart of that persistence. There, a new cold case and community accountability task force was formed, a collaboration between local activists, independent investigators, and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Their mission? To review every unsolved homicide from the 1980s through the early 2000s that bore the hallmarks of neglect or misconduct. On the task force's list, written in bold ink, was Rosemarie Calvin. Deidre Calvin sat in on the first meeting. She brought her sister's case file, its edges worn from years of handling, and placed it on the table. It was a symbol, not just of loss, but of endurance. "Every paper in here tells me what they didn't do," she said quietly. "Now I need someone to tell me what they will do." The new investigators promised transparency, though they admitted it would be a long process. Many of the original officers had retired, evidence was misplaced, and memories had faded. But technology was on their side now. DNA analysis had advanced beyond anything possible in 1996. The ligature used on Rose, the fibers from her clothing, even trace materials from the alley where she was found. Any of it might hold a microscopic clue. In May 2023, forensic technicians began recataloguing evidence from her case. For Deidre, watching those boxes finally reopened after 27 years felt like the first true step toward truth. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Each piece of evidence was a reminder of what had been ignored. Each police report, a record of silence. As the review continued, the task force also started listening, really listening, to the families of other victims. For the first time, they were invited into meetings, treated as partners rather than outsiders. Local news outlets covered these sessions, giving faces and voices to the statistics. It wasn't just about solving crimes, it was about healing a city that had carried too many ghosts. In those gatherings, one message echoed. The system hadn't just failed to find killers, it had failed to see the victims as worth finding. Community groups like Justice for KCK Women began hosting remembrance walks through the neighborhoods where many of the victims had last been seen. Photos of Rose and others lined fences and telephone poles. Candles flickered beside signs reading, "We remember you." For the first time, Kansas City's overlooked streets were treated as memorials, not crime scenes. Journalists revisiting the case began to piece together a timeline of how investigations had been handled under Golubsky's command. They discovered patterns of evidence suppression, delayed reports, and cases prematurely closed for lack of leads. Each new revelation strengthened the argument for federal oversight of the department, a demand that quickly spread across state lines. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers began citing Rose's case and the Golubsky scandal as examples during hearings on police accountability. One congresswoman read Deidre's statement aloud on the House floor. "When the people sworn to protect us become the ones who bury our truth, justice isn't delayed, it's denied." The room fell silent after those words, a rare moment where a single family's story cut through political noise. Back in Kansas City, the local government announced plans for a community reparations initiative, not in money, but in visibility. Streets where victims were found would bear memorial plaques. Annual remembrance days would be hosted at City Hall. It was symbolic, yes, but symbols matter. They remind the living that the dead are not forgotten. For Deidre, the reform efforts offered a measure of peace. She joined workshops teaching other families how to document their own investigations, how to preserve evidence, file public records requests, and demand accountability. "If we wait for them to do it," she told one audience, "we'll be waiting forever. But together, we can make them answer." The renewed attention also inspired a new generation of journalists and filmmakers. Students from the University of Kansas began working on a documentary called Unsolved in KCK, using Rose's case as the central thread. They interviewed retired detectives, activists, and forensic experts, mapping the cultural transformation of a city forced to reckon with its own history. One of the producers later said, "We didn't want to make a story about death. We wanted to make one about accountability and about the people who never stopped fighting for it." That was the same spirit driving Deidre. Still, every night when the news faded and the city grew quiet again, she'd look at her sister's picture and feel the same ache. Rose's killer was still out there. And that reality kept the case personal. Reform was vital, but closure remained the goal. The task force continued its reviews into 2024. Preliminary DNA retesting began on several cold cases, though officials declined to discuss specific findings. Confidential sources hinted that potentially valuable forensic material had been discovered in at least 3 cases tied to the same time period as Rose's, enough to warrant deeper analysis by the FBI's crime lab. No official statements have yet confirmed whether Rose's evidence yielded results. But for Deidre, even that hint of progress was more than she'd had in decades, and she wasn't alone. Families, once isolated by grief, now found solidarity. They organized, fundraised, and built an archive of their own. Digital profiles of every victim, every report, every unanswered call. It became a living memorial and a research tool, ensuring no file would ever disappear again. For the first time, the fight wasn't about one case. It was about changing what justice means. The Kansas City of today isn't the same city that failed Rose Marie Calvin in 1996. The alleys where she was found are still there, but now they bear murals of light, paintings of women once lost to shadow. The names beneath them remind passers-by that silence has a cost. And yet, the work continues. Justice doesn't end with reform, it's maintained through vigilance. Every reopened file, every forensic test, every voice raised in remembrance is a reminder that the truth can't be buried forever. So now, decades after a 39-year-old woman was found lifeless in an alley, Kansas City stands at a crossroads. The city can either remember her name as a headline from the past or as a turning point for its future. Which will it choose? And for those who still walk those same streets at night, who still see the shadows where the streetlights flicker, what do you think justice looks like now? Because maybe justice isn't only about conviction. Maybe it's about ensuring that what happened to Rose Marie Calvin can never happen again. The sun rises differently over Kansas City now. Where once there was silence, there is conversation. Where there was neglect, there's a slow but steady insistence on accountability. And yet, amid progress and reform, the truth remains. The case of Rose Marie Calvin is still unsolved. Nearly 3 decades have passed since that cold February morning in 1996, when her body was discovered in an alley off 10th Street. The years have changed everything. Technology, laws, even the police department itself, but not the ache of unanswered questions. Deidre Calvin, now older but still resolute, keeps a framed photo of her sister on her desk. Rose is smiling in it, her hair styled neatly, eyes bright. It's the same photo that has been printed on every flyer, every social media post, every memorial walk since this all began. For Deidre, Rose is more than a case number. She's a reminder of what happens when justice hesitates. "People forget the victim," she said in a recent interview, "but I won't let them forget my sister, not ever." The renewed investigation continues quietly behind the scenes. The KBI and federal analysts remain tight-lipped, citing the sensitivity of the forensic work underway. Still, family members and advocates believe the breakthroughs in DNA processing could eventually reveal something that decades of human failure could not. Truth written in the smallest of traces. In early 2025, new testing protocols were approved for unprocessed biological samples found at multiple KCK crime scenes, including Rose's. It's a slow, methodical process, months, sometimes years, but one that offers the best chance yet to bring closure. And if those tests do identify someone, that name will carry more than legal weight. It will carry the collective burden of every woman whose story was dismissed, every family told to stop asking questions. That's the deeper meaning behind this case. It's not just about solving one murder, it's about demanding that all of them matter. Rose's life, though cut short, became the spark that helped expose one of the most troubling policing scandals in Kansas history. Without the pressure her family applied, the questions they refused to stop asking, it's possible much of what came to light would have stayed buried. When Deidre speaks now, she does so not just as a grieving sister but as an advocate. She visits colleges and community groups, sharing Rose's story to remind people that justice requires participation. If we look away, she tells them, that's when history repeats itself. And those who hear her don't forget. The new generation growing up in Kansas City knows the name Rosemarie Calvin not as a mystery, but as a movement, the moment the city began to reckon with what it allowed to happen in the dark. On the anniversary of Rose's death each year, people gather in the alley where she was found. It's no longer a forgotten place. It's been cleaned, painted, transformed. A mural now covers the brick wall, a portrait of Rose surrounded by lilies with the words, "Her story changed ours," written beneath it. At dusk, candles flicker in a soft line along the pavement. Deidre stands there every year, surrounded by families holding pictures of their own lost loved ones. It's not a vigil of grief anymore, it's one of remembrance and resolve. For Kansas City, these moments are both beautiful and haunting. They remind the community how fragile justice can be, and how strong ordinary people must become to keep it alive. And perhaps that's the lesson of the Rosemarie Calvin case. That behind every unsolved murder lies a mirror, reflecting not only the darkness of one act, but the systems and silences that allowed it to endure. If justice is ever served, if a name is finally spoken, charges filed, and truth acknowledged, it will not erase the past, but it will mean that at last someone listened. And if that day comes, Kansas City will not just close a file, it will close a wound. Until then, Rose's name remains written in ink and memory, carried on the lips of those who refuse to let her fade. Because every time someone asks, "What happened to Rose Calvin?" the silence that follows is another reason to keep searching. And for those watching, reading, and remembering now, ask yourself, how many more names deserve the same fight? Because the story of Rosemarie Calvin isn't just about one woman in 1996. It's about all of us, and the kind of world we allow when the truth is ignored. Justice may move slowly, but it never truly stops. And as long as people like Deidre keep speaking, and communities keep demanding answers, there's hope that the coldest of cases can still find light. So, as we close this investigation for now, we remember Rose not for the tragedy of her death, but for the strength her name gave to a city learning how to confront its past. Her story remains unfinished, but not forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the search for justice and the untold stories behind each case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more revealed crime stories, and we'll see you in the next one.